Hi everybody, today I'm going to be modifying or altering this corset here. I'm actually going to be opening up these panels on the sides and create an adjustable lacing at the hips here. My natural hip spring is actually relatively slight, so I don't have a huge problem with a lot of off-the-rack corsets, but there are some women who just cannot find an off-the-rack corset that fits their naturally large hip spring. So if you have a corset that just does not quite fit in the hip area, then this tutorial might help for you. However, it does have a few conditions. You have to have a corset that is constructed in a certain way for this particular tutorial to work. So I'm just going to show you this corset now before I add any of the adjustable lacing, and then I will be back later on to show you how it worked out in the end. So here is the front, side, the back, and the other side. So here is the completed corset with the adjustable hip ties. So you can see that I deliberately had opened it up to the point that it's actually gaping away from my body to show how big the hip spring is capable of being. I think you could probably get about 3 inches of extra room on each side. So if this corset originally has a hip spring of about 10 inches, now it has a potential hip spring of up to 16 inches. So I'm going to show you it from all angles once more. So here's the front, the side, the back, and the other side. So if you want to learn how I did this, then just keep watching. For this particular tutorial to work, the way that your corset was constructed needs to be similar to mine. And in this particular corset, the seams had been assembled using a lock stitch. So what that is that the fashion fabric had been assembled all together, and the lining fabric inside had also been assembled all together. Those seam allowances had been pressed open, and often when you're assembling those panels, you go over it more than once and you sew right on the stitch line that you had before, which is why it's called a lock stitch, because often those 2 times you stitch each seam has a different stitch length, which locks it in place. And then you need to anchor the fashion fabric and the lining fabric together using a stitch in the ditch. And I had showed you a tutorial on how to actually construct a corset that way. So for this tutorial to work, your corset already needs to be constructed this way. Now there are different ways that corsets are constructed. Here's an example of a corset with external boning channels. So the seam here, the joint between these 2 panels, is actually underneath the boning channel. So if you had wanted to put adjustable hip ties in this corset, you would actually have to take off this boning channel and relocate it. You could still put hip ties in here, but you would have to slash in the center of a panel, and that would also mean that you wouldn't have the bones on either side of that slash to reinforce the lacing panel, so it would kind of scrunch up and might feel a little bit floppy. You would also need to rebind through that slash to reinforce it so that it doesn't continue fraying up. You can see here that the seams are top stitched, which means that most likely the seam allowances of this panel and this panel are both going in one direction, and it's actually locked down by these seams. So you can't actually just stitch up to a certain point and then stop, because the seam allowances are just anchored in that one direction all the way up there. You could theoretically clip the seam allowance of this particular panel and then fold it back and then stitch it down so that it looks neater, but quite honestly, that is a lot of work. I'm using a seam ripper to remove the binding in the back up to about 1 inch in front of the seam that I want to access. Then I'm removing the stitching that is securing in those steel bones, and I'm going to remove those bones so that the panels are a little bit more flexible and a little bit easier to work with. Here I'm taking some pliers because one of them is kind of hard to grab. So here I'm marking the lower edge of the waist tape, and I think I want to start my slit about 1.5 inches below that mark. So I mark it with chalk, and then I pin through that so that I can transfer the mark on the other side because I am out of chalk paper. So my slit's going to be 5 inches long by the time it's all said and done. So at this point I can start ripping out the stitches, starting with the stitch in the ditch because that was the last stitch that had been done when the corset was being made, and then the adjacent seams that create those boning channels.
And this, removing the stitches is probably the most time-consuming part of this. You're going to make very good friends with your seam ripper in this project. So once I have taken out all those seams, the ones in the center and also the adjacent seams that create the boning channels. So I remove all the stitches up to about 1/2 inch or 1 centimeter above where I want my slit to start. Here I'm removing the stitching between the panels, starting with the lining, and this is where I had discovered before that the seam allowances weren't pressed open before. They were actually pressed to the side and anchored down by the boning channels. So I remove the seam that joins panels 3 and 4 here, and then I carefully take my scissors and clip that seam allowance that's anchored down on the one side so that I'll be able to fold those seam allowances open away from each other. I'm extremely careful to not cut anything I'm not supposed to, and I'm trying not to cut too close to the stitch line either. And so you can see here that I'm doing the same thing on that fashion fabric side as well. So here you can see that I'm pinning back the seam allowances, trying to preserve those creases that were there before. I'm pinning the fashion fabric to the lining at the same time as I'm doing this, and so I'm doing that on each side of that slit. And you can press before pinning or after or both, but I prefer to do it after. I'm just preserving the creases that had been there before, which are easy to see because I can still see sort of the pin pricks from those stitches before.
Okay, so you can see that the seam allowances are pushed to either side and the fashion fabric is pinned to the lining fabric like that. So I'm going to go press this and then we're going to start sewing.
So with the narrow foot on my machine, I'm stitching very close to the edge, maybe 1/8 of an inch or 1/16 of an inch. I'm going very slowly here. At the chalk marking here, I put my needle down and I lift my foot up and I pivot, and then I go back and forth across that join several times to secure it before continuing to edge stitch down the other side. So now it's time to create the boning channels again, and I am marking out the width of those boning channels so that it's congruent with the width that was above where I had picked it out. So I switched to my standard foot so that I can see in between those toes, and I set my needle down where the channel had left off before so I can make it look as seamless as possible.
So here's what it looks like close up when the stitching is complete. So you can see a very, very close edge stitch right around there. That's securing the lining and the fashion layers together. Right at the very top there where you can see that chalk mark, very faint right now, but where there was a chalk mark, I went back and forth on that several times just to secure it down. I also started a stitch in the ditch right up there and came down and went back and forth right there a couple of times just to secure that seam right there and make sure that's not going to rip out. And here is what it looks on the underside.
So here you can see I'm putting the spiral bones back into their channels and they fit quite well. And now you can put the binding back on whichever way you feel is most comfortable for you. So I do have an old tutorial on how to apply binding if you've never done it before. So if I remember, I'll link it in the corner above. I am doing this the quick way, just machine stitching it on the underside and the upper side, and I'm stitching in the ditch for that second seam so that you actually don't see that second line of stitching. And that's how the binding was put on before.
Okay, so you can see both sides of the corset complete, or at least the sewing part of it. If I weren't like fiddling around with the camera and everything, I would estimate that it would take maybe about an hour per side. The biggest part of this, the most time-consuming part, is just ripping out the seams, basically. Everything else goes super fast after that. So throughout the modification, I was measuring both sides of the corset, making sure that they were symmetric. So from the bottom of the waist tape down, it's about 6.5 inches on both sides. And the same 6.5 inches on this side as well. And so from the start of the slit, which if you remember is 1.5 inches down, that would be 5 inches on each side. And if it were not 5 inches, then I would have to go back and see what I did wrong. Did I start the slit up too high, or did I put on the binding a little bit off compared to how it was before, and I would make those necessary adjustments. So all we need to do now is put in the grommets and then lace it up and it'll be done.
So I've decided that I'm going to put 5 grommets on each side of the slit, so 10 grommets on each side of the corset, so each an inch apart. Since my C-step machine pierces a cloth and sets the grommets in one action, I have to put the fray stop on before I set the grommet and then just wait for it to dry. And so you can see me doing that. And I have to redraw the placement of the grommets with chalk again after this because the fray stop actually dissolved my chalk markings from before. So let me just do that again. And then you can see that I set my grommets just following those chalk markings from before. And here you can see that I have replaced the white ribbon with red ribbon here because I thought it would look nicer against the pinstripe. So I'm just lacing it up and then I'm going to lace up the back and then we will be finished. Yay!
So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and I hope it was helpful for some of you. So if you own one or several off-the-rack corsets where the hips don't quite fit you, then I encourage you to try this out and let me know how it worked out for you. And if anybody wants me to do a different version of this tutorial where I actually put a slash in the middle of the panel instead of ripping out all of those seams, then comment down below and let me know and I'll see what I can do. And I'll see you guys in a few days for the next video. Bye!